It's been revealed Victorians were issued more fines for breaching coronavirus restrictions in the first lockdown than any other state and territory. Economist Saul Eslake discovered Victorians paid almost $6 million in COVID fines, which is $2.2 million more than the rest of the country combined. Saul Eslake joins me now live. Saul, thank you so much for your time. We'll go through the numbers in just a moment, but what is it about Victoria? Are residents here breaking the rules more than everyone else, or are we policed differently here?
Well, there's no evidence that Victorians have been breaking the rules more than in any other state. And let me emphasise here, the comparisons I'm making are during the first lockdown between late March and late May, when all states were facing essentially the same situation during the first wave, and in particular, Victoria and New South Wales as the principal entry points into Australia for returning Australians and visiting foreigners at a time when overseas transmission was the main vector for the spread of the virus. It is appropriate to compare Victoria with other states during that period. And at face value, given that Victoria collected 4.5 times as much as the other 7 states and territories per head of population in fines, or more particularly, Victoria collected 5.5 times as much by way of revenue from fines for breaches of lockdown regulations as New South Wales. Can you really believe that there were 5.5 times more Victorians for every person in New South Wales who was doing something stupid or idiotic that put the rest of their citizens at risk? No, of course not. The difference was that Victoria was much more zealous in putting the police out there looking for breaches. Victoria was much less willing to exercise discretion for minor or inadvertent breaches, and the fines which Victoria imposed for every breach were considerably higher than the rest of the country. Now, if that resulted in Victoria having a better experience, then you might defend that as a sensible policy to have pursued. But I think that the complacency with which Premier Andrews so charmingly accused his fellow citizens of displaying when the first lockdown restrictions were eased, which he in turn says was one of the causes for Victoria's second wave, I think it's quite plausible that one of the reasons for that complacency on the part of Victorians, if there was any at that time, was the sense of relief they might have felt from getting out from under what had been clearly the most oppressive policing regime when it came to lockdown regulations of any state or territory, without there being any evidence at all that Victorians were more likely to breach lockdown regulations than people who lived in New South Wales or any other state.
Well, you raise an interesting point because, of course, there needs to be enforcement to deal with the pandemic, but Victoria's strategy certainly wasn't that effective when now Melbourne's still in lockdown. We've been in lockdown for more than 3 months.
Well, that's right. I mean, contrary to what some people in the Twitterati seem to think, I'm not suggesting that in particular flagrant or repeat breaches of lockdown regulations should be ignored. Clearly, they need to be punished in order to keep people safe. But unless you really believe that Victoria has 5 times as many idiots who want to put the health of their fellow citizens at risk, or people who think that they're sovereign citizens exercising their constitutional rights to infect other people with a deadly virus, and there's no evidence that Victoria is more prone to that sort of thing than people in any other state or territory, then you just can't explain the extraordinary revenue intake that Victoria made in any other way. And as I say, if this had actually resulted in Victoria being less exposed to a second wave than anywhere else in the country, you might defend it. But on the contrary, I think it's quite plausible that the sense of relief Victorians had from getting out from what was much more zealous policing with far less discretion exercised by the police in terms of minor or inadvertent breaches of regulations, probably contributed to greater complacency by Victorians, if indeed that was a factor at all, which has never been demonstrated. And I guess, Gabriella, the thing is that while it sounds like I'm giving the present Victorian government a hard time and, might be in some way politically partisan, no, I'm not, because this is what Victoria has always done. Victoria, to a much greater extent than any other state, and despite Victoria's self-image as Australia's most progressive state, has always used the police force as an adjunct to the State Revenue Office to a greater extent than any other state. I mean, I'd also shown by looking at budget papers for every state and territory over the 5 years prior to the onset of the pandemic that Victoria collected an average of about $121 per head per annum in fines from its citizens. The average for every other state and territory was about $80 per head, and for New South Wales it was something like $65. And you only have to drive in each of those two states to know that, whereas in New South Wales, where they tell you where the speed cameras are, and so much so that if you get caught by one, you really should be booked for driving without due care and attention because it's that obvious. And if you break the road rules on a long weekend or a public holiday, they impose double points on you so that repeat offenders are driven off the road more quickly. By contrast, in Victoria, where there are a lot more road safety devices, as they call them in Victoria, and they don't tell you where they are, and despite the supposed emphasis on road safety in Victoria, they don't do double points for breaches of road rules on long weekends or public holidays, because in Victoria they want your money. Rather than necessarily get you off the road. And it was that philosophy of using the police as a way to raise revenue that seems to have informed Victoria's unique approach to managing the pandemic. And as I say, if that had made Victorians safer, you might have been able to defend it, but it clearly didn't. Victoria made unique choices about how to enforce lockdown regulations, how zealously to police infringements, how much to fine each person who was caught for infringing them. And of course, Victoria made different choices from New South Wales as to how to manage hotel quarantine as well, with, as we know, disastrous consequences. So while I'm not comparing the amount of money Victoria's raised, whatever it is, I don't know, for breaches of fines during the second lockdown, which Victoria was the only state to experience, my point is that there might not have been a second wave in Victoria if the Victorian government had made different choices, both about how it managed hotel quarantine, but also how it enforced the first lockdown.
Well, it'll be so interesting to find out just how much money has been raised in this second lockdown that's lasted 3 months, and almost $6 million was raised in the first lockdown, which is, of course, nowhere near what any other state or territory raised. Now, the government certainly isn't shying away from enforcing tough rules, handing out hefty fines. Just 2 weeks ago, as restrictions were eased, the fines tripled from $1,600 to $5,000. Can it go up any more than that? What more can they do?
Well, I don't know where they get these figures from, Gabriella. I mean, there are fines of, I'm not sure of the exact number, but it's not 5,000, it's something like $4,967. I don't know where they dream these numbers up for. I'm not suggesting, and I really want to emphasise this because people do suggest otherwise, that I'm not suggesting that flagrant breaches of regulations or repeat offenders shouldn't be punished. Of course they should be, because they're idiots who are putting their fellow citizens at risk of catching a deadly virus. So, of course, they need to be policed. But should even the most minor breaches be the subject of draconian fines? Should someone who was out after 3 minutes after the curfew have been fined whatever the fine was? I mean, we now know, of course, that the curfew wasn't something that was recommended by the government's health advisors. We know that it was recommended by the police in order to create an offence which made it easier for the police to impose fines to collect revenues. And then we had the extraordinary situation a couple of Saturdays ago where the Commissioner of Victorian Police was almost with glee saying that his officers would not exercise discretion when it came to whether to impose fines or not. Now, that's an extraordinary thing, in my view, for a police commissioner to say, that his officers will not exercise discretion. I mean, that's presumably an important part of police training, and it's certainly something that police commissioners in other states take pride in, the fact that their officers are trained to exercise discretion as to the extent to which they implement the full range of penalties that the law provides for breaches of various offences. And, you know, maybe the fact that the Commissioner of Police in Victoria thinks there's something shameful about the police exercising discretion is why Victoria's police get into trouble in some other areas as well. I don't know, but it just seems an extraordinary thing for a police commissioner to say, that his officers are not going to use their own judgment to decide what's the most appropriate response in a wide range of situations that might range from an inadvertent or minor breach of a rule to one that has very serious consequences for other people by someone who's got form when it comes to breaching regulations.
Saul, I don't expect you to have the exact figures on this, but how does Victoria compare to the rest of the world when it comes to fines?
Well, I don't have figures either, Gabriella, so I'm not going to make them up. But I'm not aware that there's any jurisdiction in the democratic world. So we're not talking about authoritarian regimes, which may do more than simply fining people, but might cart them off for periods where they're out of contact with their family and friends for breaches of regulations. But I'm not aware of any other jurisdiction in the democratic world that has seen COVID-19 as providing what Premier Andrews on repeated occasions has called and celebrated as an opportunity. They're his words, not mine. He used the word opportunity to impose bigger fines when describing some of the rules that would apply during Victoria's stage 4 lockdown. Most other governments see this as something that, you have to do in order to prevent flagrant or repeated breaches of rules that are designed to keep people safe and to protect people's health. But they don't see it as an opportunity to raise revenue.
Saul, you've noticed this for some time with speeding fines and now in coronavirus times. What do you expect in the future? Will it get any worse? Will this trend of hefty fines continue?
Well, Albert Einstein is supposed to have said that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result next time is a symptom of madness. Victoria's obviously now getting on top of the second wave and the numbers are coming down, and that's something to be celebrated. Again, let me be clear. I'm not suggesting that once the second wave was clear, the Victorian government had any alternative to imposing the sort of lockdown that it's had. The question I'm raising is whether Victorians might not want to ask if Victoria had made different choices as to how it had managed the first lockdown, which every other state experienced as well, but which every other state managed differently from the way Victoria had. If Victoria had made different choices during the first lockdown, perhaps there wouldn't have been a second one, and Melburnians and regional Victorians wouldn't have had to experience what they've needed to experience in order to prevent the second wave from getting out of control. So you'd like to think that on reflection, the Victorian government might emulate, for example, the way the New South Wales government has managed how it managed the first lockdown and how it's dealt with subsequent small outbreaks during the last 2 or 3 months, where they focused on very effective and efficient contract tracing, something that's also worked particularly well in countries like South Korea and Taiwan that have managed to avoid widespread infections or death without resorting to really strenuous lockdown restrictions. That maybe you learn from regimes that have done well rather than simply repeat the things that have gotten you into trouble in the past.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Saul Eslake, thank you so much for your time.
That's an absolute pleasure, Gabriella. Thank you for having me this evening.